Hey there fellow primates, I hope this video finds you well. I hope your week has been as good as mine. And one reason why it was good was this. Arrived the page proofs of my forthcoming book. All 385 pages of it. Found a few little errors in it, but I sent the corrections back to the publisher. So now they can go ahead and print it. So I look forward to seeing it, as I hope you do, at the end of July. I've worked on this book for a long time, and even though I've discussed aspects of it with different people, and I've given a talk on it recently at the University of Oslo, it's still very exciting and a bit nerve-wracking to find out what people think about it. So the time is getting nearer now. Now, one of the things I do discuss in the book, in the second chapter, is the history of attempts to come up with the concept of evolutionary ancestors. And one of the players in this chapter is a Frenchman called Étienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire. And he and his views are the topic of today's journal club. And here he is, a lovely drawing of him. And this video comes out on Good Friday, which some people celebrate because it involved the crucifixion of a carpenter. I celebrate it because it involves the birth of Étienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, one of the most prominent zoologists of the late 18th century and early 19th century in France. Prominent why? Well, if you are a biologist, I don't have to explain this to you, but I will. If you're not a biologist, I'll give you 3 reasons why he was well known in his own time and he's still well remembered today. One is that he was engaged in one of the more high-profile debates, scientific debates of the 19th century. In 1830, he debated no one other than Georges Cuvier, the first and foremost comparative vertebrate anatomist at the Academy of Sciences in Paris, and the topic was unity of type. What do I mean by that? Well, unity of type is to find the underlying unity underneath the surface diversity of the animal kingdom. Georges Cuvier was a functional anatomist, and he thought if you look at all animals, you can find 4 types. You can find radiates, which are the radially symmetrical animals like cnidarians, like echinoderms. You can find the soft-bodied bilaterian animals, the mollusks. You can find segmented creatures, the articulata, which are arthropods and segmented worms, annelids. And fourthly, the vertebrates, ourselves and our nearest kin. So you have these 4 distinct types, which, according to Cuvier, could not be reduced any further. They were distinct, functionally morphological pinnacles that stood in eternal isolation from each other. Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire disagreed. He said, no, I can see deeper. I can see that, for instance, the segmented creatures, the arthropods, are really just a modified version of vertebrates. In fact, there's really only one type of animal, and they all are vertebrates. And that was one of the ideas that he promoted, for which he became famous. And how did he do this? Well, second reason why we remember him today, he got his insights into the deep unity of the animal kingdom by applying ruthlessly a principle that he called the principle of connections. And this particular image illustrates you what that means. This is a mid-16th century image from Pierre Bellon Dumas. It's quite a famous image from the literature. It shows a bird skeleton next to a human skeleton. And if you apply the principle of connection, you will find corresponding bones by looking at their relative position relative to the presence of other bones. So a lower arm bone is connected on one side to the upper arm bone and the other side to digits, and you can find corresponding bones in a bird skeleton and in a mammal skeleton. And by applying this principle of connection that designates corresponding bones based on their relative position, you can find deep unity not just in the vertebrates, but according to Geoffroy, elsewhere in the animal kingdom as well. Which brings us through to one of the 3rd reasons why we remember him today. Applying this principle, he thought, well, there is really only one type. Everything is a vertebrate. Even arthropods are vertebrate. In fact, insects and other arthropods are just vertebrates that live inside their own vertebrae. That seems seemingly wacky. Moreover, you can bring an arthropod body plan into correspondence to a vertebrate body plan by inverting one of them by 180 degrees. And this is illustrated in this image from a recent paper. And you can see the top image is an inverted cross-section, or longitudinal section rather, of a lobster. It was drawn by Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire. And the green arrow shows you the gut, the red arrow the nerve cord and their relative positions, and they are identical in terms of the relative positions to those of a vertebrate, like a newt here, with the nerve cord at the top and the gut below. The middle and the lower drawing are from a work in the 1880s by Richard Owen, Britain's foremost comparative anatomist at the time. So you can see that based on the relative positions of these major organ systems, a vertebrate and an arthropod are pretty much identical when you invert one upside down. Now, this is exactly one of the points made by Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire. Look at it. Invert a lobster, and there you go. It looks exactly like a vertebrate. There is a deep unity of type in the animal kingdom, a unity of type that others like George Cuvier refused to see. And this has been consensus in the literature for a long time, especially from the early 1990s, when developmental biologists found that the molecular factors involved in setting up what we call the dorsal-ventral axis of animals are the same, comprise homologous proteins in vertebrates like Xenopus, the toad frog, and Drosophila, the fruit fly, but in an inverted position. So Catharina Nüble-Jung and Detlef Arndt were among the first in 1994, they published 2 papers to draw attention to this, that these developmental similarities in an inverted orientation in arthropods and vertebrates seem to harken back to ideas from 1822 specifically, a paper that Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire published in 1822. And ever since, for almost 3 decades now, this tune has been sung. It's like the dorsal-ventral axis inversion that you find between vertebrates and arthropods was already dimly foreseen, but very insightfully foreseen by Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire. And I will just give you 4 prominent voices in the literature to show that this is so. Stephen Jay Gould, the most important popularizer of paleontology and biology, the second half of the 20th century, and he wrote in his last book, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory, this: Geoffroy resolved this striking difference between vertebrates and arthropods by suggesting that the same ground plan underlay the development of both phyla, but that this common design appeared in a reverse orientation, with arthropods interpreted as essentially vertebrates turned on their backs. 2 years later, Richard Dawkins, I don't have to introduce him to anybody, he published a book called The Ancestor's Tale, and he wrote this: these and other details suggested in 1820 to the great French zoologist Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire that a vertebrate could be thought of as an arthropod or an earthworm turned upside down. Then in the same year, a paper published by the famous paleobiologist Jim Valentine from Berkeley, and he published a book called On the Origin of Phyla, in conscious analogy to Darwin's On the Origin of Species. And he wrote this: Geoffroy produced a model that rationalized this dorsal-ventral difference, suggesting that the dorsal-ventral axis had simply been reversed. And finally, in case you needed more confirmation, the Sentinel of Nature, the editor that makes and breaks careers, Henry G., who himself was trained as a paleontologist, and he published a book a few years ago called, I think, is it Crossing the Bridge? It's about the origin of vertebrates, and he wrote this: it was Geoffroy who adopted wild schemes in which lobsters could be transformed into vertebrates by turning them upside down. And these are just 4 voices in a very large universal chorus that all sing the same tune. And they are all wrong. You have to be quite skeptical of your own thinking when you disagree with everything and everybody you've read over the last 3 decades. But I do disagree. And I have good reasons to disagree, as I will show you now. So let me just remove this slide and this slide. If you actually read what Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire wrote in his 1822 work called General Considerations on the Vertebra, then you will find out a different story. Incidentally, I don't read French very well, but luckily for me in 2004 this gorgeous book came out. It was written by Hervé Le Cuyadé and translated into English by Marjorie Green. It's titled Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, a visionary naturalist, and this book contains, in English translation, a selection of the essential texts that Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire published during his illustrious career, and that allowed me to read his views in English. And boy, was that an eye-opener. What he did in this paper on the general considerations of the vertebra from 1882 is go to the market, get a flatfish, like a plaice, a flatfish in the genus Pleuronectes, and dissect it and look at what he considered to be the biggest framework for comparing disparate body plans, the vertebra. So he had 3 plates in this particular work. You can see here one, and it shows the drawings that he made of the vertebrae and the vertebral appendages, as it were, of the flatfish. A second plate shows you different parts of the anatomy of a lobster, including a cross-section of one of the body segments and the adjoining limbs here in the upper left. And the third image includes the often reproduced image of the longitudinal section of the lobster turned on its back to show the relative positions of the different major organ systems. Now, since the dissection of this flatfish was the empirical heart of the paper, Geoffroy looked at its vertebra and then said, well, if arthropods can be compared to vertebrates by considering arthropods to be living inside their vertebra, how do they orient themselves relative to the other? Is one flipped upside down with respect to the other, as every modern commentator maintains, or something else going on? Something else is going on. If you take a detail from two of these plates and put them side by side. So here you can see it. On the left hand side, the vertebra of the flatfish with different parts of the vertebra and its appendages labeled. And alongside of it, a detail from another plate, the cross section of a piece of the abdomen of a decapod crustacean, a lobster in this case, and its appendages. You can see that he deliberately labeled corresponding parts based upon their relative positions, applying the principle of connections, with the same letter. So in the top, you can see A prime at the top, a little bit more towards the center, A double prime, etc. Then E double prime and E prime. Then you get, for the fish, the vertebral center, and for the lobster, basically the ring of the body segment, and then below the same thing, closest to the body, O prime and O double prime, and then followed by U prime, U double prime. Oh, but wait a minute. This is a lobster flipped on its side, not upside down. But that isn't he supposed to put them upside down to make them bring them into correspondence? No. And so let me cite you 3 quotes from the work of Geoffroy. So there is a bit of text involved, for which I apologize, but you need to read his own words to see what's going on. And he wrote this. First he said, I must stop here in the face of a consideration that will not fail to be presented to me as a serious objection. Actually, I'm comparing inclusively parts extended vertically, the vertebral appendages of fishes, with parts elongated on the sides and situated horizontally, with species that the entomologists call, in the decapod crustaceans, true legs or false legs, depending on whether or not they form part of the means of locomotion, in which true legs are the thorax appendages with which lobsters walk, and the false legs are the pleopods on the pleon with which they ventilate. Well, they also swim with those, actually. So he's comparing vertical vertebra appendages in a vertebrate and lateral appendages of lobster. He goes on to say, now, here is what the law, his principle of connections, we have invoked demands. It is that, if we have suspected with good reason that the crustacean makes of one of its sides its dorsal face, and of the other side its ventral face, then its tail has to be horizontal like that of the pleuronex, the flatfish. But that necessary consequence is indeed how things are. And then he goes on to say, in conclusion, however, it will be said, how admit that crustaceans, if it is true that their conditions of existence do not differ too much from those of the higher vertebrates, really swim on their sides? Oh, so he compares vertebrates to crustaceans by considering that crustaceans are vertebrates that locomote on their sides. He says the principle of connections demands only that all be in well-established relations with one another, but it would not derogate in the least from that principle if the whole totality has oscillated within the case. He says explicitly, considering the internal organs, that if you have a fish, then you have a flatfish that lies on its side, that corresponds completely to a lobster that moves with the lobster right side down and right side up. It corresponds to a fish on its side. And, well, if that is the case, then if the nerve cord and gut and other internal organs rotate another 90 degrees, then everything is in the right position, and you turn a lobster upside down, and the internal organs correspond then to those of the vertebrates, completely inverted. But within an exoskeleton that lies on its side, that is only rotated by 90 degrees. So all people that have commented on Geoffroy's writing in the modern literature, and I've not found a single exception, say that, you know, the dorsal sides of a vertebrate correspond to the ventral side of an arthropod. Pays Geoffroy, they're wrong. There has been a dorsal-ventral axis inversion between the two. They're wrong. Geoffroy maintained that arthropods are vertebrates that move on their sides, and then the internal organs rotated by another 90 degrees to get the proper relative positions of both internal organs and the external exoskeleton. What modern authors miss is that the entire paper, which is called General Consideration on the Vertebra, uses its framework of comparison the vertebra and its appendages, not the relative position of soft internal organs like a nervous system and a gut. Yes, we do that today. For instance, we call protostome animals with the ventral nerve cords gastroneuralia to reflect that fact. Or another reference framework often used to understand body plan evolution is the fate of the blastopore. Protostomes that form the mouth from the blastopore and deuterostomes that don't do that. But those are different reference frameworks from the one used specifically by Geoffroy. And he used the vertebral appendages and thought that arthropods live inside their vertebra. So dorsal and ventral don't correspond in arthropods and vertebrates. It's the dorsal side of a vertebrate. Sorry, the dorsal side, of a vertebrate corresponds to the lateral side of a lobster. Lobsters are vertebrates locomoting on their side, and that's true for all arthropods as well. And nobody gets this right. And I don't think there is any deep reason for this other than that people don't read the original sources. Maybe like me, I'm not a good reader of French, and I had to wait for the English translation. They didn't read the French, and they just cited each other, although they do cite Geoffroy, but it's clear they haven't read Geoffroy. And that is a principle in the research of my book that I've encountered again and again. It is very easy to just cite secondary literature, which, by God, I do a lot in that book, because with 1,000 references, that's enough. I couldn't read every single original source. But sometimes when you do read original sources, especially those not published in English, you may well find that what people think is consensus, even though it is universal consensus, like in the case what modern authors think Geoffroy said, is in fact nonsense. He said no such things, especially in my chapter on Ernst Haeckel. I discovered that what a lot of English-speaking authors think, I don't see anything confirmed in the German writings of Haeckel himself. So I thought, on the 250th birthday of of Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, I shall honor his memory by reading him appropriately and trying to present his views accurately for the first time on video, I'm sure, and in my book in writing, I guess I'm one of the first, unless I have missed a source, which is always possible, in the last few decades. So yes, dorsal-ventral axis inversion, that's not an idea that Geoffroy presented. Dorsal-ventral axis twisting, with arthropods being vertebrates that fall on their sides, yes, that's what he suggested, but that's not an idea that is echoed by any modern writer. Okay, this is a short one today. I hope you found this interesting. If so, like it under the video, subscribe to the channel. If you really want more alerts in your life, sign up for alerts. If not, don't. I wish you a happy Easter weekend. I hope it's going to be a good one. The weather should be fantastic. I'm looking forward to seeing some of my Dutch friends. They're coming over to London. I hope they don't get stuck at airports and whatnot. I will hopefully see you next week. Stay safe. Ciao, ciao.